I'm Dominic Della Sala, forest ecologist. Let's answer your questions from the internet. This is Forest Support. At Unruly Obnoxious asks, I wish there actually was a mother tree like they showed in Avatar. I watched that movie too, and I was fascinated by it. The mother tree was the central tree that connected everything in ecosystems in very vivid colors. And I had a similar experience when I was in the Borneo rainforest. The fungi were all lit up in bioluminescent colors. You didn't need a flashlight to walk through that rainforest at night because it was so colorful. And those trees are very unique to the Borneo rainforest. When they are cut down, they don't come back because they have very specific pollinator relationships. So Gaffer9 asks, how do forests regenerate after fires naturally? Seeds blown in from outside the fire zone. One of the fascinating things about forests is after a severe fire that kills all the trees, it's not an ecological catastrophe. In the ashes, they will release cones, like the serotinous cones of lodgepole pine that need intense heat to burst open their seed cones. There are trees that will sprout after a fire, like a madrone. They will take advantage of this nutrient-rich environment to release their seeds in a seed rain so that their progeny will develop into the next forest. So life and death are both important in a forest and are both needed for the healthy systems to function. Leope asks, what did ancient forests look like? If we go back in time to the period of the dinosaurs, trees were a lot different. They were gymnosperms. They weren't angiosperms, so the flowering plants had not really developed at that time. The monkey puzzle tree is a good example of that. It has all kinds of needles on it. The story is that a monkey looked at the tree and was puzzled by how it was going to climb that tree with all those needles on it. At Perfect Day to Play, how do trees access the internet on a camping trip? They log into the Wood Wide Web. Well, there is some reality to that, even though it's a funny, corny joke. Trees are connected through their mycorrhizae networks. These are fungi that attach themselves to the roots of plants and allow them to communicate through chemical interactions. There's been some really interesting work done by scientist Susan Simmerad, where she actually described connections on the root systems of plants that allowed them to communicate chemically to one another. And the closer the relationships between mother and progeny, the more connected the underground network was in that fungal system. So trees have a lot of different ways to communicate. When there is an infestation coming, they will release pitch that will trap insects that are landing on the surface of the tree trunk, and that will be a signal to other trees in the forest that they're under attack so that they can prepare their defenses. Richard Bisk asks, why do we have so many forest fires in California? It seems like we have a lot there. Fires have been burning in California for millennia. If you're living in Southern California, chances are you're experiencing fires during high winds, the Santa Ana winds. That will propagate fires through chaparral, shrubby, grassland areas. In other areas of the state, you're going to get fires in forest that, by and large, are very beneficial to these ecosystems. They need fires to rejuvenate themselves and to allow their seeds to develop into larger trees and forest vegetation over time. There are unfortunate consequences when fires spill over into communities, and there are ways that we can prepare for that. The way to do that is to make sure that your roof is a composite or metal that's not going to burn. Make sure that your open vents for ventilation have proper screens on them. Make sure that you're clearing a defensible space around the home itself out to 50 to 100 feet so that your flames will not carry from the wild areas onto the roof and get into the vents. Zen Trier asks, my tree exploded. What is going on? There is a tree that sort of explodes. It's called the sandbox tree, and its leaves and its spine are toxic to humans. And when it releases its seeds, those seeds can be projected at high velocities and cause a lot of damage to people and animals. Twitmo Pro says, what the do you know about forest management? Trump is exactly right about cleaning up debris and fallen trees from the forest floor. It's really very simple. Well, no, it's not simple, and Trump is not right in cleaning up the forest floor. This is not just going out there with some rake of the forest floor to get the leaves off the ground. What Trump is doing is clear-cut logging that actually will make fire more prevalent in those forests. There's about 760 million acres of forest in the United States, most of which are under private ownership. There's about 190 million plus acres of the national forest system. They are not all protected like national parks. Most of them are open for a whole variety of uses, including logging. When you log a forest, a lot of that logging slash, the twigs, the leaves are left on the ground. Some of it's treated, but a lot of it's left on the ground, and that provides the kindling for these fast-moving fires. So the Trump executive logging orders, which is directing the federal agencies to do more logging, is actually going to make them more prone to forest fires by taking out the big old trees that are the most fire-resistant parts of the forest and leaving a lot of flammable logging slash behind. Eric Hovind asked, what do tree rings really prove? Well, tree rings are a living record of the tree's growth patterns. So this tree is about 30 years old when I count up all the rings. The tighter the rings are on this, it means that the conditions for growth during that year weren't as good. It might have been a drought. The wider the rings means that the tree was doing better. The conditions were more favorable, and the living part is the outermost section that has the xylem and the phloem, which is the tree's circulatory system that is passing nutrients to different parts of the tree and water. The other thing we can note from this is the bark of the tree. So the bigger the tree, the more bark it will lay down, the more insulated it is from most forest fires. If there was a forest fire, there will be scars that have been laid down across the rings so that you can actually determine what year the fire was occurring in that affected this tree. So Pundit Review asks, is Smokey the Bear full of 9 out of 10 wildfires are caused by humans. Hashtag smoke this. When you add up all the fires across the nation, roughly 9 out of 10 have a human cause to them, and it's associated with high road densities, population centers that have access to wild areas that can cause a fire accidentally. Let me address the second part of this question. Smokey Bear would appear in posters and logos, and his motto was, only you can prevent forest fires. And it was really targeting campfires, but then it got blown out of proportion and became the symbol for the Forest Service policy to put out every fire start by 10 a.m. the next day, which is destructive and catastrophic to ecosystems that need fire to balance out their growth and rejuvenation and aging processes. Harry Awareness asks, how much of a dent in climate change will Mr. Beast's 20 million trees project make? Planting trees is a good idea in the right places, but it is not going to make as big of a dent in the climate crisis as protecting our existing forest, especially the old-growth forest. So an old-growth forest is a biological cathedral. The tall, wide, big trees in those forests are really important habitat, and they also represent the accumulation of atmospheric carbon that you see in their trunks. There's no replacing those trees by planting the little seedlings that will take hundreds of years to start accumulating that carbon. At Oliver Hangout asks, I have to do a presentation in biology and I have to present 9 slides about the boreal forest. Like, what the is a boreal forest? They are cool forests found in places that are very cold. As you can see, the green area on this illustration, just below the Arctic Circle, is where these forests occur. They have all kinds of different tree species growing in some extreme conditions where we get a lot of snowfall. You'll get conifer trees like pines, and you'll get some hardwoods like aspens. They are the places where most of our migratory birds wind up during the breeding season. The boreal will support up to 1 billion birds during the summertime. There are other kinds of forests that exist around the planet. The next latitudinal zone are the temperate regions. In the United States, most of our forests are temperate. If you go to the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Crest Trail and you're hiking through those areas in the forest, you're in a temperate zone. The temperate forests have all kinds of really interesting tree species. They're a mixture of oaks, conifers, and aspens. It's really quite biodiverse. And there's a subportion of the world's temperate forests that are actually temperate rainforests. An example would be the Olympic Peninsula in Washington or the Tongass rainforest in Alaska. The trees are enormous. They grow to over 200 feet tall. They are as wide as this table. Those rainforests are absorbing so much carbon and giving so much habitat to the salmon that will use those rainforests. They'll come up the streams and spawn, and then their carcasses will be eaten by eagles. The eagles will poop out their remains, and that will be fertilizer for the rainforest trees. Now, if we get further south into the southern hemisphere, now we're talking tropical rainforests, which have all kinds of unique tropical species in a very wet and hot environment. If we go over to Europe, where there are only small fragments of rainforest, like in the UK, the trees are much shorter. They only grow to maybe 30 feet tall instead of 300 feet tall, but they're still rainforests because they're blanketed by rainy conditions. They're just different in terms of the height of trees and the type of tree species there. Here's a question from Cora. Is it true that there is a forest that is a single living organism? Arguably, forests are interconnected superorganisms. If you look at an aspen forest, it could have originated from a single aspen tree that would send out its below ground runners, its suckers, that would then come up through the soil and be an entire group of trees from the single organism. Spontaneously Peaked asks, how do forests return so quickly to the northeastern United States, which had been almost completely deforested? The northeastern forests were almost completely deforested over 100 years ago, and that led to almost the entire elimination of old-growth, virgin, ancient forests. However, there's been a century or so of no logging activity in some of those forests that are now maturing and returning to older characteristics. So most of the forests that you get in the Adirondacks or the Appalachia region had been logged over a century ago. So they're really secondary forests. And that's the beauty of forests. If we allow them to recover, if we don't log them the second time through, they will develop those attributes that make them uniquely old. Private Tumbleweed asks, is it bull that there are more trees on the planet right now than there has ever been in all of history? Well, yeah, it is bull. We've been deforesting the planet for thousands of years. The scale of that deforestation has increased, and so currently we're down to about a third of what the forests were on the planet before all of this widespread deforestation had taken place. And of that group, only about 28% are considered primary forests. Those are forests that have never been logged. So that's why you can't just say we're planting trees and just counting that there are more trees we planted now than ever in history. It's because the quality is really important. You can't plant an old-growth forest. It takes centuries for those forests to develop. Matthew E. Gunter asks, do rainforests create rain, or does rain create rainforests? It's actually both. Trees are remarkable because they take in rain and use it, and then they go through evapotranspiration, where water evaporates, returns to the atmosphere, and becomes the water cycle again. So the two are connected. And so when rainforests are cut down, they can actually change the regional climate. So when that rainforest is removed, we see more droughts. C. Hayes 55 asked, are they still burning the Amazon rainforest down? So this is a pretty general map of the Amazon rainforest. You can see in green color areas that are still intact, they haven't been logged. And then you see these other areas in orange that represent deforestation that has occurred. Rainforests are being cut down, burned, and cattle are then grazed over the area, and that then triggers these droughts that we're now seeing in the Amazon basin, because we don't have the return of water to the hydrosphere and the atmosphere. So if that keeps happening, the Amazon will eventually flip into a drought-stricken savanna and lose all the rainforest benefits. That could happen within the next couple of decades, depending on the speed at which climate change progresses across the planet. At James Russ 42, without cheating, in what country is the oldest forest in the world? Approximately 180 million years old. Well, I think of the Danum Valley, which has trees that are hundreds of millions of years old. The trees are called diptocarps. They can be over 300 feet tall. They're also the home of the orangutan, which is an endangered animal that will raise its family in the upper canopies of these rainforests. WYA 42 Wallaby Way asks, trees suck in CO2, right? So where does it go? Do they just hold their breath? Through the miracle of photosynthesis, they will absorb carbon dioxide. When it's absorbed by the tree, it makes its food. And like us, when we have too much food, we store it. A tree that is 300 years old, like a Sitka spruce in Alaska's rainforest, has been out there absorbing carbon for centuries. That carbon has been stored in its trunk and in its roots, and it's really important for cooling down the planet during the current climate crisis. At Macabre Salmon, I've always wondered, why do pine forests smell of air freshener? Actually, air freshener smells like pine forests. So trees will produce a terpene when they're under stress. It's a chemical that you smell in the forest when it's at a certain level. The really interesting thing about this is that there are certain beetles that can detect those terpenes, and they will continue the process, accelerate it towards the tree's death, which is not a bad thing in the forest, because as that tree dies, it's creating habitat for all this wildlife. And as it dies and falls over, it is being recycled into the nutrients in the soil. At Carter KR, I'm writing an essay on anthropogenic natural disturbances on a forest ecosystem, which is a fancy way of saying things that up trees. Well, things that really are not good for trees are clear-cut logging. When we go in there with chainsaws and we kill all the trees, that causes a major unnatural disturbance to the forest ecosystem, which causes all kinds of problems for wildlife habitat, which releases carbon to the atmosphere because the trees are no longer storing it, and it also can damage water supplies because you need to have a road system for most of these places that are doing logging, and those roads are funneling all kinds of sediment pollution into streams. And when there's a lot of trees dying in the forest, like is happening in the Rockies, that release of chemicals will trigger an outbreak of insects, like in this case the beetle outbreaks, that then kill the trees and turn the forest a kind of red coloration as the needles are dying in those forests. Trees also will experience natural mortality agents. The American chestnut is functionally extinct in the wild. There's a fungal pathogen that is very specific to American chestnut trees and kills them before they can mature and become part of the old-growth forest. At Matt Powers Soil asks, do you know the layers of a forest? Yes, I do know the layers. Let me walk you through the different layers of a tropical rainforest. So if you can imagine yourself on an elevator and you start at the top level, the penthouse, the emergent trees, then you move down a couple of floors and you're in the canopy of the forest, and that is where most of the trees are. Below the canopy, you can get into younger trees. They're the trees that have been suppressed below the dominant canopy. Sometimes there's a tree that dies, creating a gap that will then result in a race to the top as plants try to fill that gap in, taking advantage of the nutrients and the light levels. And then we've got even more complexity on the forest floor. You kind of think of that as the basement of the forest. There's all kinds of different species and mycorrhizae, fungi in some of these forests that add to a layering effect that we see in these older forests. At Mental Symphony asks, quick question, why do trees stop growing at the same height? Me, what kind of high-ass question is that? trees will stop growing at a certain height. Really good example in California is the coast redwoods. Those trees can get to over 300 feet tall, and they stop growing because they can't get all the nutrients and the water up to the top of the tree canopy. So they will compensate for that by living in the fog belt. And that fog belt surrounds them in moisture so that they don't have to figure out how to get all that water up to their top because they've already got water there from fog. And so the way plants get water and nutrients all the way up to their stem is they have what's called the xylem and phloem tissue. It's like a series of tubes that allows them to get that water up all the way to their stems and out to their twigs and their branches. And it's remarkable. It's like the tree's circulatory system. Here's a question from Cora. What is the difference between a tree farm and a forest? I consider a tree farm where all the trees are planted in rows, like a crop, a monoculture, a Franken forest, that are grown mostly for timber yield. A forest is a living ecosystem. It's trees interacting with other vegetation, with the soils, with wildlife. The trees are different ages, they're different sizes. When you go into a Franken forest, the trees are all the same age. There's hardly any structure. There's very little habitat. So you lose all of those special benefits that we get from the natural forest. Jay Superswan asked, how do controlled burns work? Well, they're not really controlled burns. We like to call them prescribed fires. And so what managers of a forest might do is they might light a fire under certain conditions so that they can clear the understory in a low-intensity burn and reintroduce fire to ecosystems that need frequent fire in a low-intensity way. Ryder Fang Fang is asking, do trees compete with each other in nature? The trees will compete within and across species. When trees come back after like a natural disturbance, the seed rain that happens will give you a lot of tightly spaced trees that are all competing for the same limited nutrients and light levels in a forest, and they'll eventually sort it out because there are winners and losers in competition battles like this, eliminating those that are less fit and less adapted to that site. Some plants will release a chemical called an alleliopath, and that will kill surrounding vegetation so that plant will prosper and outcompete its competitors. So those are all the questions for today. Thank you for watching Forest Support.